Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GODAN's webinar series. On behalf of the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar series. Today, we have a very interesting and important webinar, specifically on GODAN Action colleagues are doing on evaluation of open data projects. And I think this is a really important webinar in the context of capacity development initiatives of GODAN as well. From the GODAN capacity development, we have been very grateful for GODAN Action, the work that GODAN Action colleagues have been doing on a lot of range of activities, from the e-learning programs to all these kind of activities. So I'm really looking forward to listen and to what our presenters today are going to share from their experiences, Rob Locos and Laura Miguel Ayala. So I will be introducing the presenters, and then I will hand it over to them to share their experiences on this area. So our first presenter is Rob Locos, who is a project manager of ICT projects and research infrastructure at Wageningen Environmental Research. He has a lot of years of experience in information systems development in scientific and commercial environments on a lot of domains, from agriculture, food security, environment, grow environment modeling. So he has huge amount of experience in all these areas. And Rob is coordinating the GODAN Action project, and he's focusing on achieving impact by engaging with open data in agriculture and nutrition. The second presenter is Laura Miguel Ayala, who is a project manager at Wageningen Environmental Research. And she's working on impact assessment in various domains of expertise of Wageningen University and Research, and among others, water management and land use. Laura is currently working on impact evaluation of open data in the GODAN Action project, and she's also coordinating the impact evaluation for the Legend program of Land Portal Foundation. Laura has a broad experience in international research and development projects, among others in Latin America, and recently worked on implementation of an integrated water management climate smart coffee production project as well. So we have two excellent speakers who will be presenting for this webinar, and I request all participants if you have questions, please use the chat window to share your questions, and at the end of the webinar we will make sure we will answer these questions. So it's my pleasure to hand over to Rob and Laura for this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Sushit, for this introduction, and thank you all participants for participating in this event. Yes, me and my colleague Laura Miguel Ayala will talk a bit about the work we did on impact evaluation in GODAN Action. So let me first start with a little bit of background about GODAN Action for the ones that haven't heard this before. I know that there were more webinars about GODAN Action, but I can imagine that not everybody of the participants has participated in them. So, well, GODAN Action is all about open data and about using open data effectively, building capacity on open data so that people can understand the potential of open data for agriculture and nutrition. And, well, the important thing there is that they can also engage with it practically in the developing context. So we're concentrating on, let's say, the sometimes more difficult conditions in developing countries, particularly. We've been looking at three different work strands. First was about standards and interoperability. So that's about, well, standards, technical standards of data, and how to use standards and open data according to specific standards in innovative services. The second one was about impact assessment and evaluation of open data projects and their impact. And the third one was about well, capacity building, so building tailored training courses for online and face-to-face trainings. And in this webinar, we're going to concentrate on the impact assessment part of the project. Second relevant thing about GODAN Action to know beforehand is that we use a thematic approach. So to get a little bit more practical and to be able to focus on specific domains and specific networks, we focused on three different themes, which allowed us to work with real world cases and with real networks in practice that work with open data. And these are the themes that we worked on: climate and weather data, which was the first one we worked on already in 2017. And then last year we also worked on land data and nutrition data. Unfortunately, our colleague Evangelia Badu couldn't attend because she's had to apply exactly at this time for citizenship of London. So I guess that was a case of first things go first. So we won't touch the nutrition case, but we will talk a little bit also about climate and weather data and about land data. But yeah, let's first of all introduce a little bit of the work we did on evaluation of open data. What we did in the project is try to develop some guidelines for impact evaluation. Eventually the outcome of that was an impact evaluation framework, which looked like this. Well, very simplified. This is, let's say, the picture that we always use to introduce it. It kind of has, like you can see, three parts. There's a question, or three research questions, I could better say maybe. First question is, how does an initiative or project achieve change? So that's about how the project is, let's say, developed and how it tries with its activities to achieve change using open data. One important thing there is the use of the theory of change. We will see that coming back in the presentation later, also in the thematic topic introductions. The second one is how well is the initiative being implemented. So once you start a project, how is the project doing? How are we working towards impact? Can we do things better maybe? And the third question is, how well did the initiative contribute to the foreseen impact? So that goes a little bit towards evaluation at the end or after the project. And there we focus a bit on outcome evaluation instead of impact evaluation. But I will come back to that a bit in the rest of my presentation. So this is actually the basis of our framework. And at the end of the presentation, I will give you some links to the deliverables that we have, among others, the framework itself. And if you take a look into that, you can see that for every question in this framework, there's a set of steps and a set of, let's say, guidelines to do those different steps within those questions. So there are a few things relevant here. We decided to focus on relatively short development projects that use open data. So not on the, let's say, 10 or 15-year programs that really in that time can achieve impact, let's say the long-term impact, but on short projects that are usually not capable of going towards the full impact chain during their lifetime. Still, we support whole lifetime evaluation. So we already start with impact evaluation actually before the project. So you use it to develop your project itself. Then you use it in the project to do monitoring and evaluation and to do improvement. And then after the project, you can use it to, let's say, do an ex post evaluation of the project. And well, one thing I need to emphasize is that they are guidelines. And it's not a guaranteed and ready-to-use recipe for success. But I mean, if you take a look at the framework, you'll probably realize that while reading it. I want to concentrate on some of the lessons that we learned while developing and using this impact evaluation framework ourselves. Well, the first one is evaluate, learn, and improve. So never stop learning, the picture says. One of the most important elements in our frameworks is that we emphasize that evaluation is just not something you only do after a project. You should start already before. And one of the important things of that is to be able to learn throughout the process. So make the theory of change before you start a project, monitor that, change it if it's needed, see what happens in your environment and what affects the things that you're doing. That will allow you to learn during your work and to improve on your activities. So yeah, that comes back to evaluate before, during, and after the project, and well, specifically learn from what went well and what not, and also apply your activities or change your activities if needed. The second thing is evaluate before you start. Already said, start evaluation or evaluation kind of activities already before you start your project. So you know how your impact change works. So you know what your activities are going to deliver at the end of the project, but also how people are going to use it now. It eventually results in impact. That's one thing. And a second thing is choose your activities wisely. So yeah, that means you should also beware of the environment. So anticipate on the circumstances in your specific region or country, let's say the politics around open data, those kinds of things, because they're really quite influential on, let's say, the capacity of a project to achieve certain impacts. Also focus on activities where open data has a clear added value. I mean, you have to realize that in a lot of cases, open data is just a part of a project. I mean, it helps in doing your things, but it's not the only thing. There are a lot of other things that influence your results and the impact in the end. So if you want to evaluate the effects of open data, choose, let's say, indicators and activities that really have a strong link to open data. And also take a look at specifically the barriers that you might encounter. I mean, you can have a real nice theoretic idea about how your project is going to work, but for instance, if politics are against you, for instance, then it will be really hard to achieve those goals. We run into this ourselves in our activities on weather data, where we found out, well, that's kind of a logical thing in the end, but weather data has quite some, let's say, commercial and strategic value. A lot of weather data services are under the Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Aviation or part of disaster risk management and are quite strategic. So it's not that easy to find open weather data, for instance, and you really have to start with advocacy in a lot of cases to be able to get weather data open and to use it in kind of an open way. Next thing which kind of connects to that is choose your impact indicators wisely. So suppose you are a small project, a relatively small project with not, let's say, tens or hundreds of millions of budget, but just a modest budget, then it's often not realistic to achieve, let's say, a very high impact. So that's, well, one of the things we say is look at outcomes. So let's say not the impact on livelihoods, which funders usually ask, but something in between, let's say, your project outputs and the final impact that your funder might envisage. So yeah, just remember that you cannot achieve the SDGs by yourself. Be realistic and look for clear outcomes that use open data. I already said it before. Focus on things that really utilize open data, and also make sure that you can measure them and explain them. So let's say take into account that you only have a short time within your project to do what you want to do, and if you want to measure something, be sure that you can already measure it within the project. And also make sure that your budget is probably not enough to do extensive quantitative research on impact. That's really nice if you can do that, but it's usually also quite requires quite some effort and quite some budget. So, like I said, be realistic. See what you can do with probably a limited amount of budget within your project. And I'm thinking also of an example here. Yeah, what we did again in weather data is, I mean, in the end, of course, you want that farmers, smallholders, benefit from the open data that you use to provide farm management services, for instance. But in some cases that we studied, we saw that it was probably wiser to focus a bit on intermediaries, like service intermediaries, and how they could reuse open data. I mean, if you can really help them using open data, then you might, let's say, theoretically also suppose that in the end, that will also benefit the farmers where they deliver the services to. So even though you might not be able to measure the end effect on farmers, you might be able to show that you're helping intermediaries to use open data and to provide something which is more than they could provide before to farmers. Liaise with the right stakeholders. So yeah, there's in this picture there's a well, different stakeholders. You see a board of directors here. There you see a group of farmers. You see politicians. You see ICT people. And it really depends on what you're doing, what's relevant for you. I mean, if sometimes you have to focus on politicians. If you want to do advocacy, for instance, that might be the case. Sometimes if you really are into farmer service, you might focus a little bit more on farmers. And in the case of open data, which tends to be quite technical, it's probably also important to take a look at, let's say, the more technical people, especially because they might be better able to let's say, help you explain it to, for instance, their bosses or to politicians than you just explaining it to them. Because, I mean, they are closer to the people that you want to reach, and they could probably easier help you to explain. So remember that in some cases you might not be the best one to explain success of your project yourself, but you might have to use critical friends. Well, we call them critical friends. Let's say key stakeholders that you know well, and that you know are able to connect to web networks that are important for you, and also able to kind of explain for you the effects of your project. The last lesson that I want to talk about is your stories of change. It's not always easy to prove impact or to prove the effects of a project, but usually you can also use stories of change. I mean, narratives that you find in the area that you're working in that prove that, let's say, your data or open data in general has some effect. So it also helps explaining to people that are not that familiar with open data and the technicalities behind it. So the advice here is, first of all, to use narratives, but especially narratives that people recognize. That might be something which is directly related to your project, but also something which is related to, well, the same kind of project within the same region, or maybe something well, totally different if you cannot find something. And also it might be something which uses closed data sets examples. I mean, closed data and open data is not that different. I mean, it's nice if you can use open data, but if you can use an example that uses closed data to explain your story, then that's also useful. Well, we, for instance, have used the impact story of NOAA, which is the US weather service that opened the data a long time ago, and there's a lot of study been done on the effects of that on all kinds of sectors over the world, and you can really find even, let's say, economic figures on the impact of yeah, that specific action that I did 10 years ago. So even though it's, well, a different scale than you are doing at that point, and even if it's an example that is not from your country but from the US, it helps in explaining what you could reach with open data if, let's say, circumstances would be kind of ideal. So, yeah, having said that, yeah, I would advise everybody to take a look at the framework that we developed and dig a little bit into the details, see if you can learn something from that and use it in your projects, of course. And we want to also focus a bit on the case studies that we did while developing the framework. So we developed this framework stepwise, and we kind of tested different parts of it within case studies in the 3 topics that I just mentioned: weather data, land data, and nutrition data. So I have a few slides about what we did in weather data. I guess most people well know that weather data is kind of important for agriculture. Well, weather is changing a lot. I mean, there's climate change, and weather patterns are changing, and I think a lot of farmers in a lot of regions can already see that happening. And yeah, growing seasons get less predictable. So there's also high risk profiles for farm and food production, which is also again linked to, for instance, insurance and finance. So knowing about weather and weather forecast and weather patterns is very important for all kinds of aspects of, let's say, farming and farm management and farm advisory. And what we try to focus on in our case studies is, let's say, co-creation between farmer organization, business, and government. And we kind of try to focus on service intermediaries and how they could use open data to improve the situation of smallholder farmers. Yeah, that's what is actually in this slide. So yeah, there we used, well, direct and indirect information from farmers and farmer organizations. We looked at cases where there's also things like microfinancing, microinsurance providers involved. Capacity building was quite a relevant thing there. Building capacity on using open data, and stories of impact that motivate, well, national governments, for instance, and weather service to be more open. Like I said, in this case, you run into a lot of closed data and protected data, and I think there's still a lot of work to do, especially in weather data regarding advocacy for open data. This is a small picture of, well, this is something you also find back in the impact evaluation framework as a method, a little method to kind of map your stakeholder landscape. You can see that we have looked for the different stakeholder groups that play a role in weather data and providing farm advice to farmers, and also kind of try to map them as, let's say, how influential they are and how interested they are in improving services for farming, and using open data to do that. So it's just an example of how we used a specific small method to, let's say, do a step in our impact evaluation towards, in this case, well, better understanding the weather domain as such. Like I said, open weather data is very much protected still for the reasons I just mentioned. It's crucial for a lot of strategic domains: disaster risk management, aviation, military applications. It's also, well, at least considered of high commercial value, because everybody knows the stories, for instance, in Europe and in the United States, where weather services were bought by companies like Google and Monsanto for a lot of money. So there's a lot of protected behavior around it. Consequences that has been kind of monopolized by governments and large businesses, and sometimes it's hard to get access to. So you really have to work hard to use it within project, let alone use open data to do your project. The other thing is context is rather technical. I always say meteorology is kind of science, and the people that work in meteorology are rather hard to follow sometimes, let's say. And there's a lot of, let's say, legacy data formats and legacy tools that exist and that they use, and they're not really easy to use for outsiders. So it takes a lot of effort to start working with weather data if you really want to use it in, for instance, creating farm services. The other thing which plays a role is that it's hard to create and maintain reliable and reusable services, because, well, first of all, you need observation data probably, so data from weather stations. And observation networks are not always that reliable up till now. So you might run into a lot of data gaps within measurements. There's also forecast modeling, so weather forecasts, which is kind of a, let's say, profession in itself, and it's really quite hard to build up capacity on forecast modeling itself. So you're usually stuck with using information from services like well, ECMWF or NOAA, like I mentioned. And then there's also the issues of documentation, interoperability, and availability of tools and methods. So there's a lot of things, well, around capacity and capacity building that are relevant before you can start using open weather data. So the last thing maybe, and that's not only for weather data, but it's more of a general point. Open is often also regarded as free data. So the fact is that open data is not always free. I mean, you are allowed to have fees for open data if you need to cover, for instance, the expenses of building up the data or maintaining the data. And like I said, it doesn't always match with the strategic character of weather data. So open is not always very logical to the stakeholders that manage weather data. Very shortly, one of the cases that we worked on in this project, it was a project that is done in Bangladesh, where they're using weather services for farmers, or they're using weather data to develop weather services. In this case, they're using open data, which comes from the American Weather Services, and they use both the historical archive of weather data and weather forecasts. They foresee a lot of impact. They try to enroll more than 300,000 farmers in the coming years, and expect they will have about 10% savings in their cultivation practices because of the advice that is generated through those farm management services that are developed. And in the end, our result should be an economically viable service. I think the key issue there was the business model, because, well, you might recognize the fact that it's quite easy to set up a service if you have a project that is funded to build up this service, but it's usually quite hard to keep it sustainable after the project. So in this project, they have a business model where they have different, let's say, ways of earning money, let's say, with the service they provide to kind of maintain the service and make it sustainable. Well, last news from this project is that they have been quite successful, although not, I think, still at the 300,000 farmers level. But they also run into quite some problems, even though, as I've heard, let's say the director of the company, the seed company that's providing those services, is a very high level politician also in Bangladesh. Still, they run into quite some problems in, let's say, getting their services operational because of all kinds of barriers they run into, technical barriers, political barriers, of course, barriers with relation to the business model and the fact that it's really hard to have farmers pay for services like this. So that's still in development, but it kind of shows, let's say, I think a typical environment that a lot of service providers trying to use open weather data run into, which is effectively only partly let's say, dependent on open data. There are a lot of other things that are playing there, which will also play if you use non-open data to do those kinds of things. So I think I'll now hand over to my colleague, Laura. So she'll explain a little bit of the work she did on land data together with some colleagues in the project.
Try to be brief because we're looking at the time. So indeed, I will talk a bit about the land data case study. So to start with, why did we choose land as a case study? Why this topic? Well, if you talk about agriculture and nutrition, land lies on the basis of it, on the foundation of it. So as well as for food security interventions, is very much related to land security, the security of the land. And also in relation to this, there's the fact that the 70% of the world's land is unregistered. So without the security of the tenure, farmers are at a greater risk of displacement and dispossession. So for example, if someone goes and claims the land of a farmer that doesn't have the land rights in place, this would be at the greatest risk of eviction, for example. They also do not have access to financial markets, so banks are not prone to give credits or loans if you don't have your ownership in place. They are less likely to invest in agricultural operations, and they are also very likely to lose their cultural heritage, so to say. So we, for this case, we focused on aggregators, on the level of aggregators, to get a better insight on the land data ecosystem and its dynamics. So an aggregator is it's an organization or a platform that gathers and collects, packages data in a summary way, so it becomes more visible and more accessible and easier to use by people. So we wanted to have representatives of aggregators at local, regional, and global level. So what you see there on the right is it's a table with all the institutions we had contact with at the 3 levels I mentioned. So we had an interview with one representative of each institution, and we talked about how they use the data, in which context, what are the data needs they encounter and the barriers, and how do they define sorry, impact of open data according to them. So some of the results sorry, we found, it's a bit of a long list, so I will go for the main ones. Are as for data needs and challenges, as I said before, land tenure data is undocumented, inexistent, or outdated. There's still a huge customer tenure system in place, so land transfers are not always registered. There's no history of these records. The costs for a proper land administration system are usually very high, and governments are usually not able to afford it. And there's a huge disconnection between the government understanding and what the on-ground reality is. As for the openness of data, we found actually a bit of a double-sided vision. So on one hand, it gives the data sharing gives increased visibility, which turns out into more funding or financing access. But there's also a bit of a fear of misuse of this data. For example, if there's data on valuable species in certain area and is disclosed, well, there's more risk for corruption practices, for example, in that area. And the impact our interviewees envision or have seen or hope to see is, for example, help indigenous communities to secure their lands, inform and disseminate more among actors like land practitioners or academia who can further advocate on these issues. I'll just skip a few. Open data brings transparency, accountability, and protection against corruption practices, which eventually leads to better governance. And there's a value of the products generated by open data, products and services that can be happening because this time and resources are devoted to these products instead of investing in data collection, for example. So with this information, these needs and barriers, we developed this theory of change, which is, well, a bit of, it's not a fixed recipe, so there's no organization or project that can tick all boxes, so to say, but we aim at just drawing pathways or possible ways to achieve impact. So what you can see there at the very bottom is the situation, what I mentioned about the land data unregistered. Then we mentioned a few data issues and proposed interventions according to what we heard. And from there on, we draw certain outputs and outcomes at short, intermediate, and long-term levels that eventually would lead to overarching impact. So, for example, if we take on the very left intervention collecting data, this would lead to or reflect on more existence of data on the ground, increased knowledge, increased transparency in land markets, a more equitable land governance, and eventually this would contribute to enabling secure land tenure. And very briefly, also the contribution to from this case to the framework. Rob already explained the 3 questions the framework is based on. So this is how we would approach it from the land data side. Perhaps to emphasize the first question is what you see there is what we learned from Cadastre, Nederland, one of our global aggregators. So what they do is they draw an ex ante assessment to assess the conditions for success. So they evaluate the 3 pillars, the technical, the legal, and the institutional, before they start a project. If one of these pillars is not likely to be fulfilled for whatever reason, they would reconsider their involvement in the project. So they really make sure beforehand that the conditions for success are there, so to achieve impact at a later stage. Secondly, well, we also focus on the outcome and process evaluation. As Rob explained, we just emphasize a bit what kind of indicators we can use to measure whether the impact we want will be achieved. And thirdly, the ex post impact assessment. So how good did we do in achieving what we promised? In this case, contributing to land tenure security. I think this was from my side on the land part.
Yeah, maybe just a concluding remark. From GODAN Action, we can provide some support for evaluation if you are interested. Can at least contact us. These are our email addresses. We can see what we can do together. The other thing is that there are some links here to the resources that we have developed. First of all, like I said, the evaluation framework, which, well, explains in more detail the different steps within those questions that are, let's say, on the left side of the screen. There's a knowledge reservoir, which kind of refers to a lot of existing methods and case studies on evaluation. We didn't start this whole exercise from scratch because we thought, well, it was useful to reuse bits and pieces from other methodologies that already existed. So what we did on the track was also to collect this information and to put it into, let's say, a knowledge base of material that is, let's say, referring to impact evaluation or to case studies that do impact evaluation. And then the other 3 are referring to the 3 themes that we did and kind of report more extensively on the case studies we did within the 3 themes: weather data, land data, and nutrition data. So that gives you a little bit more insight into the projects that we looked at and the work that we have done with those projects while developing the impact evaluation framework. So I guess with that we can conclude and go to questions.
Thank you very much, Rob and Laura, for your very informative presentation and a lot of ideas you presented. I think this really interests all our participants. So I would like to inform all our participants, now we have an option to ask questions through the chat window. So please make use of the opportunity to ask any questions through the chat window, and we will get that questions answered by the presenters. So Laura and Rob, thank you for this presentation and your 2 examples on the weather data as well as the land data examples you presented. I think really important, especially for smallholder farmers' perspective from developing countries. And I'm interested because you, Rob, mentioned about the success stories for weather data, but for land data, were there any success stories done, or especially for smallholder farmer perspective?
Sorry, success stories? Or?
Yeah, for for smallholder farmers, were there, as part of the evaluation and monitoring, were there any success stories of some examples of how open data has benefited smallholder farmers? Did you consider that?
Yeah, well, what we've developed is maybe not in the format of success stories, but we have developed impact narratives.
Okay, great.
Which also in the big theory of change that I showed, then we kind of highlight the pathway that a global level would follow, or a regional initiative, or a local one, just to give a bit of an idea. And those you can find in the links Rob also suggested.
Great, thank you very much. So we now have questions coming in. So one of the questions is, can the speakers explain what protective behavior means? They protect the privacy of the data or something else?
Well, since the data is considered to be very sensitive, because it's used, for instance, for military purposes or for aviation, or to recover from disasters, those kinds of things, they're not very eager to just provide it as is and to have everybody, let's say, play around with it. So it's, yeah, there are different reasons why they say, well, we want to have full control of that data, and we are not going to just put it on the internet for everyone to use, which is on one way understandable because of the things where it's used for. But on the other hand, it's, yeah, kind of hard because agriculture, I mean, it's really relevant to agriculture, but it's usually not, let's say the Ministry of Agriculture is usually not the ministry where weather services are done. So it's rather indirect, and it's also, yeah, for, let's say, small business, for instance, that want to do something with weather data, it's really hard to get it. I mean, sometimes they can get it if they pay for it, or if they have a good relation, special relation with the weather services or with the ministry that provides or governs those weather services. But it's usually quite hard. So yeah, that's what I mean with protective in this case.
Thank you, Rob. Just a follow-up question, because I remember you mentioned one example of that from Bangladesh, how you are using. So, for example, that example is specifically you are looking at, for example, that economic model was for like using mobile services, if I understand correctly, right? Advisory
yes.
service.
Yes, but mainly through SMS messages, I think.
Okay.
Although there is also the option, I think, to use smartphones, but it's mainly SMS.
SMS, okay, great. But can I also ask, for example, in many of the developing countries, again, there is big lack of like even lack of internet access and things like that. So have you considered options like for especially for localized weather information, things like radio for as a means of disseminating localized weather information?
Yes, that's an option. Weather information as such, I mean, then you're probably talking more about, let's say, a radio weather forecast, which is useful for farmers, of course, very useful even, but that's not something where you can, let's say, as a service provider, take data and combine it with soil data and crop data and stuff like that and provide farm advice. So it's very useful for farmers because that's one of the ways they can kind of anticipate on short-term weather circumstances. But yeah, for let's say integrated farm management service, you really need the data itself and not, let's say, the narrative of the weather forecast, but really the data, the temperature data, the precipitation data per hour as forecasted. So yes, it's very important, and I think it could even be somehow integrated with regional or local, let's say, farm advice. I'm not sure if that's done in Bangladesh at least, but of course it would be a possibility, I think.
That is, I think maybe something which, especially in areas where there is less internet access and they have issues with even electricity. One of the kind of mediums I find very useful in some of the remote parts of the world is still the radio. So things like that, not traditional, not the internet based, but maybe it's something to think about. So we have other important questions coming in. So this is a question from Stanley, who is asking, what is the role of open data in solving perennial hunger in Africa? So it's a more broad question.
So in solving
hunger in Africa specifically.
Yeah, that's a good question. Very difficult to answer. I mean, it's like what I said with open data. Weather data is just a small part that you need to do better farming and to, let's say, increase yields, increase the livelihoods of farmers, and in the end also, let's say, provide them with options to educate their kids and stuff like that. I mean, it's a very long chain towards that kind of impact. But I think weather data is one of the things you need to improve farming. But there are many different other things. So it can have a small role, but an important role, I think.
Yes. Thank you, Rob. And I think it's a quite broad kind of aspects as well. So I think this is one aspect that need to be handled. And there is another question from Tom, who is asking, can you please explain further what you say open data, why you say when you say open data is not entirely free. Are you going to share the notes with us participants?
Okay, well, I don't say that open data is not free, but it doesn't have to be
Not
free
always
always, because I mean that's the idea with a lot of people, that open data is always freely available. You can just take it from the internet. But officially, according to the most let's say mostly used rules for open data, you are allowed. Allowed is a strange word here, but you can charge users for, let's say, the small cost you have to maintain the data. That could be a business model behind providing open data. So there's not a guarantee that everything which is open is really free of charge. Although I think most data providers strive to have their open data free of charge. But it's not a guarantee.
So next question is
maybe one thing, maybe as an example, what we do in the Netherlands, we have an open data repository at our institute, which we provide for free, for instance, for non-commercial use.
Right.
So people that use it for non-commercial use can use it like that, with some attribution to, let's say, our institute. But if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you should still have some kind of contract, which can differ, let's say, according to the application. But so that's an example of how open data is not always free.
Thanks, Rob. So the next question is asking, is pre-project evaluation the same as needs assessment?
I think
needs assessment is a part of the project evaluation. You should also take other factors into account, like the context, the socioeconomical situation.
Yeah, I think if you're going to think about it, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, I think our plea will be then to have your needs assessment that broad that you can, I mean, really look at the impact chain, not only at the project and at what you are going to deliver within the project, but also what the effects will be in the future when people are starting to use it. So, I mean, that kind of broadens the perspective a bit, and probably will also change your needs assessment, including also what is needed to, let's say, make things sustainable and usable for your end users. So, yeah, let's say the perspective, the scope might be different, maybe. Although a good needs assessment might also consider this in the end. So.
Sure.
Another question from Stanley is asking, do you have researchers from developing countries actively involved in your project?
Yes, well, as they cooperate in the case studies that we did. But I'm also looking to Lara.
Well, in the interviews, we talked to researchers or land practitioners from all over the world, but it was a collaboration if they are not involved in the project per se, if that's what they are asking. Yeah.
But what, for instance, we have done within the project, and which is not specifically part of the impact evaluation work, but we also do a lot of capacity building works, and there we have a trainer network, and we have a capacity building network, which kind of, it includes all kinds of, let's say, key persons in developing countries that we have trained in open data and open data management, that are now training people in their region, using our material and using their experiences and the material that we provide to kind of, let's say, spread the word also. So that's one of the mechanisms we use.
Thanks, Rob. And I think maybe it's also worth mentioning that even the GODAN Action partners, like CTA, they have huge networks in the developing world who are all involved in one aspect or other. And I can also mention, for example, the capacity development working group of GODAN. We have been all the outputs from GODAN Action has really benefited the capacity development working group, and our members are mostly from the developing world. And in fact, we have over 1,500 members, and These are all mainly from the developing world, and they have been very actively participating in the GODAN Action e-learning programs. Even those who didn't participate, those materials which are made available later. So there is a huge benefit and participation from colleagues in the developing world for the GODAN Action output. So if you have any other ideas for more ideas on how you want to be involved, I will suggest you can either contact the GODAN Action colleagues. Their contacts are there, but also please join the capacity development GODAN capacity development mailing list. This is a fantastic way for you to engage more on your specific topics, as well as share, like peer learning basically. So if you have some ideas on how open data is working or not working in your particular context and regions, please use the mailing list to share your ideas. And there is a really good way to create discussions and peer learning. So that's one aspect I will encourage all of you to participate as well. So if you have any other questions from participants, please make use of the capacity of the chat window. We'll be more than happy to answer the questions. And I have just one question for you both. So you mentioned these resources. They are going to be published in the F100 or F1000 in the GODAN portal, right? Later.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Great. And can I also ask? So when as part of the capacity development part of the GODAN Action, the materials that are there, for example, the land use, those ones, what is the impact stories? Are they already there, or are you going to put that? I didn't correctly understand. Some of the impact examples.
Is it there already? Or capacity building material?
Some, yes.
Some of it.
Yeah.
Some of the, right. Oh, good.
Oh,
Good.
some, yeah.
I think
And
that would be really useful
yeah.
resource. So maybe in this the land data evaluations, if I later I will make sure I look through that, because I think that might be very helpful for some of the work which we are doing currently now as well.
Yeah, those will be there. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So for now, they're on Google Docs for now, because they still have to go through an approval process. But once they're approved, then we'll put them on F1000 on the GODAN working area.
Okay.
And we would be happy to receive ideas for testing the framework in any of the topics. You're welcome to ideas.
So I think because we have no other questions, I want to thank Rob and Laura for their excellent presentation, and I also want to thank all participants for joining us today. It's really great to have you all join this GODAN webinar. We have recorded this webinar, and we will make it available later through the CTA's channel, to make sure those who were not able to attend today, they can also get access to this webinar. I want to also specifically thank our colleagues in CTA, Chipo Mesingi and Chris Addison, and all other colleagues there who have helped to organize these webinars. This webinar series has been a great tool for us to reach out to a lot of colleagues around the world and share ideas on the work that has been done by many colleagues in open data and agriculture. So my special thanks to all CTA colleagues for making this happen. And we are looking forward to welcoming you all for the next webinar. We have webinars every month. So in next month, we will be announcing the webinar details in the GODAN Capacity Development Working Group and the GODAN website later. So I want to invite you all for that as well. So for now, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and have a good day. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.